Hello, and welcome to a conversation on homelessness from a biblical perspective. My name is John Mark Eccles, and I am the founder and CEO of The Field's Edge. We are a local nonprofit in Midland, Texas, building a permanent, supportive tiny home community for the homeless.
And I'm Dr. Raymond Morehouse. I'm the founder and director of Inherit the Earth, a ministry based in Redlands, California that works with those who are experiencing homelessness. My PhD is in biblical studies, and for the last 5 years, I've been engaged in full-time pastoral and chaplaincy work with those who are living on the streets in Southern California. So in this first session, I'd like to talk a bit about the definitions of homelessness and how those definitions change the way that we think about the causes of homelessness and the solutions. And then after we've kind of looked at that a little bit, an expression that I think we both found helpful, the catastrophic breakdown of family, and what we mean by that and how that affects this whole issue. We've been talking about having a more biblically informed approach to dealing with homelessness, and actually a lot of what we've talked about could probably apply to poverty alleviation or mercy ministry in a lot of ways more generally. And we know that the Bible says a lot about the poor and our obligation to be generous and to be helpful and to be hospitable. And there's a really interesting passage that we've talked a lot about in the past, and we want to look at a little bit more in this session from Luke chapter 12. And so I'll read it, verse 13 to verse 21, but actually to the end of the chapter is all very, very relevant. But Luke says this: "Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' And he said to him, 'Man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you?' And he said to them, 'Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness,'" or more literally, greed. "For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying, 'The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God.'" So what are some of your thoughts and things that you've learned from meditating on a passage like Luke 12?
So much. I mean, I think about the different times in my life and the things that I've been motivated by, and the way that I have chosen my path after getting out of college and getting into a career and seeking the next thing, just kind of by default, not really with a heart that was at least outwardly greedy, but just sort of having this life plan that is, okay, well, I'm going to work and I'm going to build wealth and I'm going to give my family security and I'm going to be comfortable and I'm going to be able to retire, and that's the good life. That's just sort of what I was doing, and when I became aware of that, it really just kind of wrecked the whole picture and really caused me to evaluate these things. And I think a lot of that came from reading passages like Luke 12 and seeing that the way that I was thinking was not the way that God would want me to think. So that's just personally how I've kind of grown in this passage over time, and something I think is a really important thing for us all to consider.
Yeah, and it's interesting though that I'm trying to think of the right way of putting this, that Scripture encourages us to not pursue those things, right? We talk about the build bigger barns gospel, right? Which is what this rich man in the parable has embraced. The good news, right, for him that he tells his own soul is, here's the good news, soul. I'll build bigger barns, and then I'll have a bigger place to keep my stuff so that my life can be stable and that I can have security in the future as well as pleasure in the present, because I've got this great plan. And the plan falls apart because he's not guaranteed another moment. And so, so the application of the parable, as you were just saying, is that we recognize that and we say, what are we living for? What are we investing in? Treasures on earth or treasures in heaven, or however we frame that. And yet, to be engaged in mercy ministry or whatever you want to call it, whatever title it comes under, benevolence in some churches or organizations, working with people experiencing homelessness, we are working to help them acquire more material things often. I mean, that's the need that we're trying to meet. So how do we square doing that work for other people on behalf of other people with what Jesus says about not living for those things?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about, because you're right. We do default to trying to help the people that we're serving to have the things that we have, to have the home, the vehicle, the job, the clothes, the stability. And we're doing that, I think, maybe because we think that's the best thing for us. But I think if we really got down to it, we could recognize that those things are not making us happy. Those things are not the things that are giving us fulfillment in our life. Inherently, they're not bad on their own, but it's about our heart posture toward them. And I think that obviously a person who is homeless needs to have a home, and we want them to have stability and all of those things. But that being the end game is, I think, where we sell ourselves and them short, is by saying, like, if you had all these things, your life would be worthwhile, it'd be fulfilling and valuable. But in our own houses, in our own neighborhoods, depression rates are skyrocketing. People are miserable and lonely. They don't know their neighbors. The epidemic of loneliness and addiction and everything else is not limited to the streets. It happens in our suburbs. And it's because we've leaned on these things that we feel like are going to fulfill us, but they just can't. They're not built to do that.
Yeah, that's right. And we've talked about these deaths of despair, which you alluded to there, that have this underlying maybe not cause, but a root that it grows out of loneliness, of depression, of unfulfillment, a lack of purpose, and all those things. And it's not driven, and maybe there's better research on this, but nothing I've seen suggests that it's driven by economics. Some people, especially if you look at the world as a whole, some people can be very happy even if they're not as economically prosperous as maybe we would consider. We wouldn't consider them rich by our own standards. And so, how do we? So I guess, the question becomes, if we take Jesus seriously about our own lives, how does that change the way that we help? How do we help people that we think are in, they have material needs that we want to meet? And I think you're exactly right, that you recognize that even where those things are necessary, and some things are necessities like housing, food, clothing, employment, even going beyond that to other things, it's necessary, but it's not the sum total of the solution. Right? It's necessary but not sufficient. It's something we're obligated, I think, by commands in Scripture to offer, but also we offer it knowing that it's not going to be the end goal, right, of everything that we do. Sometimes the way that we talk about the Bible's teachings about poverty and riches, and maybe this isn't some of the more extreme cases, especially when you're looking at the teachings of Jesus, but it's as if the best possible scenario, like this ideal Christian community, would be one where you've got a bunch of mansions and a bunch of hovels, slums, and I don't know, every couple of weeks or so, everybody just switches place because the rich give all that they have to the poor, and then the poor get what the rich have, right? And then they become the rich, and then they come under that same sort of scriptural command, give what you have to the poor. And so you just go back and forth, sort of switching places economically. And I think that's what's kind of hard to understand sometimes about the subtlety of these biblical commands, is that if there's something necessarily evil about riches or with being rich or even just having more than your neighbor, that even the command to sell all that you have and give to the poor, which is what Jesus will say later in Luke 12, well, the implication of that would be that you would be making the poor more rich, richer than you are. And then what should they do? They should give it all away and give it back to you, because now you're in the place of the poor, right? But I don't think that's what Jesus is teaching, and I don't think that's kind of it's kind of an absurd scenario that we could imagine. But rather that the people who are in a position to help ought to help as much as they possibly can, so that those who are in need of that help can be brought up to a position economically, we might want to say, or socially, where they are also able to offer that same amount, or not a same amount, but that same quality of help to those who might need it as well. And so I think about what the Bible teaches us about work, which is essentially that each one should be providing enough for themselves so that they have what they need, but they also have enough to be generous. And so that being the ideal situation.
Yeah. So what does that look like in terms of, this man in the parable who has this big barn? I mean, let's just use him as an example. What would be the right way for him to respond to a neighbor in need? He's obviously a good farmer. He's got a gift there. He's been able to store up food and supplies and all these things. And what we've just talked about is that none of that is inherently wrong. The gift he was given to be a good farmer is from God. The provision of the crops, that's all from God. I mean, farmers are praying all the time, knowing that they depend on rain and the Lord to grow their crops. And so, he's been given these things by God's providence. And so, if he was seeking to follow Christ and to serve his neighbors, what should he do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the first thing that we notice from the parable is that tearing everything down to build bigger barns was a bad move, right? Because he's not guaranteed a future in this life, right? Which is really the point of the parable, that his security in the present and his safety and enjoyment of the future had actually very little to do with his material prosperity, which is a great cautionary reminder to all of us, especially because we live in what is, especially globally speaking, an incredibly opulent and prosperous civilization, right? You talk about one man's field. We look at our entire corner of the globe. But then to think, well, what should he have done instead? Or if we could tell the parable with a different ending, right? I think that there's so much to be said just about the simple application that Jesus gives at the end of Luke 12, which he says, sell what you have and give it to those who have needs, and thereby store up treasures for yourself in heaven. And so thinking about the way that we use our material wealth to have eternal consequence and eternal glory and eternal savings account, as it were. And so and I think this actually can transform the way that we engage in poverty alleviation, or when we're working with somebody who is, sometimes even in an obnoxious sense, the beggar. That what you have in those moments of generosity is an opportunity to be investing in that much deeper and richer economy, in God's economy. And so actually having our minds transformed by that, by saying what we do with our material belongings matters a great deal. It matters a great deal to God. And when we have the opportunity to bless other people in that way, we are being provided by God and to a certain degree by that person in need with an opportunity to be investing in an inheritance that cannot be lost, is incorruptible, and will never pass away. And so, that's kind of the first way I would say that to the person who's found themselves, whether it's naturally or by virtue of their talents and their their position in life, they found themselves in a position to be materially prosperous. I'd say what a tremendous opportunity you've been given to be investing as much of that as is possible in eternity, right? And so I don't want to ever pull that punch so that we feel like a lot of times we come to these parables of Jesus and we say, well, whatever it means, it can't mean what Jesus said it meant, which means what I do with my bank account or my savings account actually matters to God. It's like, no, it matters a great deal. How would you answer that question? What should he have done instead?
I think you're right. It's about the opportunity. It's about viewing your resources as an opportunity to serve God, to store up those treasures in heaven, and that's really where the Field's Edge name comes from. Is from Leviticus 23, leaving the edge of your field for the needy and the sojourner, and it's about using those resources that you have above and beyond your needs to bless and help and lift up other people. I think that it's super important to view your resources that way, but I also think it's important to go back to what we've talked about from the beginning, that even those without resources, material resources that are looking to help people, the best thing that we can provide, even from somebody who has every dollar in the world, is friendship. And so I think that an important thing for the man in this parable would be, yes, to sell his things and to give to the poor as Jesus commanded him to do, but beyond that, to give himself to the poor, to go with his resources and to build people up and to walk with them and all those things. That's something that is not really mentioned in the parable itself, but I think it's implied by the rest of Scripture that it's not devoid of relationship. Jesus is not telling him to just stay at an arm's length from people who are in poverty and to sell his things and give it away to them and not be with them. That's not the heart of Christ. He's saying, sell your things and go be with these people and consider them your neighbors and lift them up and teach them to farm. You have those skills. I've given those to you. So in my mind, that would be the way that he and we ought to respond to this parable.
Yeah, that's right. Because when Jesus says that even when one has an abundance, a man's life does not consist of his possessions. That's not just true of the rich. It's also true of the poor. And I think that there are ways that we can pursue relationship and ministry in the area that we're talking about that communicates, sometimes not even subtly communicates, that your material, it communicates to the people that we're trying to help, your material prosperity really is where the meaning of your life is going to be found, right? So you don't have a job, or you don't have a savings account, or you don't have a house. Yeah, you don't really have much of a life worth living. Like you're actually, in some sort of twisted way, you are subhuman, right? And you sometimes will hear, we both probably heard this, people describing people living in extreme poverty or experiencing homelessness, say they're living like an animal. And what they don't mean to say is that person is subhuman, but in a very subtle way, they are looking at the material circumstances of a person's life, that they're unhoused or they're unbathed or they're hungry or something like that. And they're saying because of that person's material lack, they are living a less than human life. In other words, they're saying Jesus is wrong. A man's life does consist of the things that he possesses. Now, obviously, I think there's a way that we're using those kinds of words to try to communicate something more charitable. But I think there's a very subtle way that, especially as Christians who ought to know better, we do preach that false gospel of the build bigger barns gospel by saying, if you could just have X, Y, Z, then you would have a life worth living. Then you would be fully human. Then you wouldn't be living like an animal. But as Jesus himself said, I am living like, a fox without a den, all of those sorts of things. Was Jesus less than human? because he was not materially rich? I mean, obviously not. Obviously not. And so I think the way that we structure our ministries and whether it's a church benevolence project or ministry itself, or whether it's foreign missions, or whether it's a new nonprofit, or one that's been going for some time, thinking very carefully about how do our structures and our practices communicate gospels, plural, to people, and if there's more than one gospel being communicated, which one is the right one? Which one is the true one? Is the gospel that, once you have an abundance of material prosperity, then you'll have a life worth living? Is that being communicated by our programs, by our staff, by our volunteers, by the way that we approach life? And if it is, thinking really hard about how do we better modify that, because the Lord, who gives us the true gospel, says otherwise.
Yeah, and I think another thing to consider in that is how when we want people to obtain those things, and we say if you'll just have a house and a job and clean clothes and the ability to take a shower, like you're good. I think at least in myself, when I was walking through these things as a new believer and trying to help the homeless, to some degree, looking back, I think that I assumed that once they had those things and they reached that level of material abundance, that I was done. That I mission accomplished. They're there, and they're no longer on the street. They're not needy anymore. They can go on and make some friends and have a life, and I don't have to be part of it. And I think that's that hesitation in our own hearts to extend ourselves to people and to suffer with them and to have really true compassion for them. It's easier to put lipstick on the pig, per se, and help somebody to reach a level where they can kind of spread their wings and fly and then step out of the picture, than it is to walk with somebody for years through ups and downs and difficulties and setbacks and hurts and frustrations, than it is to just give people some stuff and send them on their way. So I think the way that Jesus calls us to this is just, again, reiterating the fact that he doesn't just want our money. It's not just material. We'll say that it's not less than material, but it's certainly more than material. And he wants our hearts in this. And so I'd say to anybody who is wanting to get involved in serving the poor in any capacity, that yes, ministries need money to operate, and we've got a lot of things to do, and things are expensive. But more than that, we need the hearts of people around us to step in and say, the people that your ministry is called to serve have value, and I want to be part of investing my resources, my heart, in that place that is beyond this world, that is in heaven with God, by serving people and giving myself to people and exposing myself and being vulnerable to people. That to me is just the critical piece that Jesus is asking of us. Not just to say, don't build bigger barns and sell everything you have and give your barn and all your possessions to people, but give yourself to people.
Yeah. In terms of practical application, we keep coming back to this again and again and again, that what God is asking us to do in our generosity towards others is not less than offering material help where it's necessary. The food bags, the hygiene kits, the building housing, all of those things. It never should be less than that, but it also should never be only that, right? That it going above and beyond that to say that sometimes actually those material things, as necessary as they are really just the medium or the vehicle that leads to a deeper relationship and a better relationship. I think we both experienced that in our own ministries, where unless you or I had shown up with the 5-gallon jug of water or the breakfast burritos or the survival kit for the cold weather season, like there wouldn't have been an opportunity or a moment, right, to build relationship through showing genuine care and concern through those things. But rather than wasting that moment and just saying, I think along the lines of what you're saying, that moment would be wasted if it just became about that transaction. Like, it's cold weather season. I'm here with your sleeping bag. Here it is. I'll see you next year, right? Like, what a waste that would be. As necessary as that sleeping bag is, what a waste that would be if we weren't willing to go beyond that, to building into a relationship, a gospel-shaped relationship that says, I want to share Jesus with you. I want to be Jesus as much as I imperfectly can be. I want to speak his words. I want to share his love. And if you want to walk with me, I want to take you to meet him, right? As much as I'm able, as a foolish, imperfect, fellow traveler on the road of life.
Yeah, and that's a difficult thing to kind of, in our minds, to take that jump, to say you're gonna embrace that kind of weird conversation if you're bringing a hygiene bag to somebody you've never met before, and to say that you're not only going to leave the bag, but you're also going to try to use that moment relationally. That can be intimidating for somebody new, and even those of us that are seasoned to capture that moment and to use that moment. And it's always tempting to not. So, I mean, what do you say to somebody who's brand new, maybe talked to homeless people a couple times, and they've been invited to go and serve and to try to be relational with a burrito or something? Like, how can they, in that moment, be faithful to that calling to acknowledge the humanity of the person and to be relational and welcome them in as much as they can?
I think one of the most powerful things that you can do for somebody in that moment is pray. And so I've always found sort of trying the awkward transition into a spiritual conversation. It always just feels really cumbersome to me, and maybe I'm not good at it. Maybe somebody else is, but sometimes that happens. But I've always found that when you're offering, especially when you're in the act of offering something to somebody like that hygiene bag or whatever it is, that simple question, is there anything that you need prayer for? Or just, can I pray for you? Can be a really beautiful way of introducing that element to a relationship and to a conversation. And I can't tell you how many times, this has happened even when it's someone who's a relative stranger, how many times that I've offered to pray with somebody. And if you feel comfortable even asking permission, can I put a hand on your shoulder? Or whatever you're comfortable with, whatever they're comfortable with, and you pray as God leads you. Pray the gospel, pray with conviction and with content. You can say a lot of things. Prayer is a conversation, not just with God, but with everybody who's there. And so you can say a lot, even to the person who's there in prayer. But how many times I've done that and opened my eyes and I've looked into the face of that other person and just seen tears streaming down a person's face because they experienced something, even if it was just a human connection, but something more than that as well, because God is in the midst of that.
That's right.
Yeah.